when I think about philosophy, when I think about mental health, when I think about recovery, goals, right? One of the things that I get caught up in as I'm thinking about personal development is the misconceptions, right? What the
Mhm.
pitfalls. And you talk a little bit about that in your book. What do you feel are some of the misconceptions? And I know you focus on the phrase the good life, right? We think about, keeping up with the Joneses, or when I finally arrive, I'll have X, Y, and Z, or when we envision the good life. What are some of the misconceptions about that approach, do you think?
Yeah, there are a lot of layers to this, and to help people sort of wrap their heads around it, I introduce sort of a three-dimensional framework to help people understand these different things that we mean when we say happiness. And so you can imagine that there's a chessboard sitting in front of you, and there's an x-axis and a y-axis, of course. So the left and right is pleasure and pain. So if you go further to the right, that means you've got more pleasure at that point in your life. Left is more discomfort, pain, suffering, right? And that's one way of measuring happiness. And some people seem to navigate their lives exclusively on this level, just trying to avoid pain and discomfort and experience more pleasure, right? And I think most of us, though, learn pretty early on that, well, this doesn't really work. We have to be able to make sacrifices. We have to be able to endure some discomfort if we want to achieve some long-term success. And so that brings us to the second dimension, which is the y-axis, kind of moving further away from you or closer to you on that chessboard. And so this is loss and gain. So this one seems a little bit more enlightened. We learn as adults we can, choose to forego the drunken party if we want to work on our research paper for more long-term success, right? And what I argue is between these two dimensions, basically, this is how we navigate our lives by default. We balance pleasure and gain, and we try
Mm-hmm.
to balance the two and try to achieve the best possible outcome of them. The problem with this is that even this sort of enlightened two-dimensional way of navigating our lives still doesn't always map onto reality. It doesn't always deliver. We'll experience something that seems like it should be the best thing ever, and it should make us very happy. We maybe win the lottery, and we can spend all our new money on all the pleasures we could imagine, and you would think that would make us as happy as possible. But
Mm-hmm.
if we look at the data, actually, lottery winners very quickly fall back to their previous levels of happiness. And we can see the same thing if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum. We look at people who lose their legs or lose their jobs or their marriages in some cases, and they end up saying, either, oh, I got over that very quickly, or, it was the best thing that ever happened to me in some cases. And so clearly we've got an inadequate map that we're navigating on. There's
There's a
something that
disconnect there.
doesn't exactly, there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
And so to try to make this a little more clear to people and give us a better map, I've introduced a third dimension. So you can imagine turning this chessboard into a three-dimensional kind of topographical chessboard. So now we've got mountains and valleys, and we've got this third axis, the z-axis, where we can move up and down in these mountains and valleys. And I argue that this is the one we should actually be paying attention to. And it's the one that's hidden from most of us and not a big part of our culture right now, even though it's been talked about through philosophical history and even in modern psychology. It's just been kind of neglected. And on some level, I think we know it's true, but we don't all know we know it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the word that I use for this when introducing it first is admirability, because I think
Mm-hmm.
this connects pretty quickly. We want to admire ourselves. We want to get to a place in our lives where we're taking the actions and exhibiting the traits that cause us to admire ourselves the most. This is how we move up higher in this z-axis and climb the mountains, but it's also how we avoid the valleys and the pits
Mm-hmm.
of depression.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you look at depressed patients, they very often have an extremely negative view of themselves and their own strengths and skills. And I use the term virtue, which has a really rich, hidden, philosophical background. But today it kind of comes across as preachy and kind of moral purity, that kind of thing. And so I try to get across, this is, it's translated from the ancient Greek word arete, which sort of meant excellence in a lot of ways. And so really it's about being excellent at the traits that we value. Some of those are moral, some of them not so much. It's everything from courage to creativity to compassion. And what I argue is that our brains are sort of monitoring us all the time, and they're regulating our moods according to the virtues that we see in our own behavior. And that's the Z-axis. That's how we climb higher in actual deep well-being instead of the superficial sort of two-dimensional plane.
Wow, that is excellent. Now, to be fair, I did thumb through your book, so I have a foundation. And I actually, was stewing on this as I went to sleep because it really resonated with me so much, and it makes sense, it clicks. But just to make sure that our listeners, our viewers are grasping what we just drove by, right? So we all live our life by the motivational triad, more or less, right? As we've heard it phrased, right? There's pain, pleasure, and convenience, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, we want to avoid pain or we want to seek pleasure. And ideally, we'll take the path of least resistance to those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much what motivates us, right?
Right.
And if we have a hard time seeking the things that make us happy, well, with enough fire land our bottom, then we'll get busy, right? Avoiding the pain. And this kind of this constant negotiation, right? And then getting, we are rather dichotomous, right? Good, bad, black, white, happy, sad. We tend to think about life that way, right? Or in the immediate. Yeah. The things that we think will make us happy, we tend to pursue those, right?
Yeah.
Pay off the mortgage, keep the bills, so on and so forth. And tend to live a very transactional lifestyle. But as you've mentioned, those things don't always make us happy like we think they will. Hence, you gave the example of the lottery, right? And so what we're saying is like it's not just a negotiation of the pain, pleasure, loss, and gain, right? The two axes. But there's something else going on there, right? That is the axis you talk about. Now, you classify that, well, you said some of the philosophers have classified that kind of mentality as seeking excellence. But can we talk a little bit more about the idea of excellence and what that means? I know you touched on the word virtue, right?
Yeah. So I think first to your point, clearly we are, naturally, biologically driven by these simple pleasures and motivations and the avoidance of pain. But we're also a little, in some ways different from, other animals, and that we can sort of coordinate long-term strategy for maximizing these things. And so I think in many cases, it's our desires for short-term pleasure can be distractions from the values. I say in my first book that desires are the screams you can't ignore, and values are the whisper that it's sometimes hard to notice. And so I think it's extremely important that we pay attention to these values, these things that we're wired to admire and to pay attention to in others and also in ourselves. And that's really what this virtue thing is. Now, I actually argue in part 2 of the book that there's a good reason why humans have these virtues that we care so much about and that we admire in others. And this goes back to our sort of evolutionary environment and the social landscape that we sort of evolved to contend within. I think that the reason why a lot of these traits that we see in humans exclusively, like creative intelligence and generosity, the reasons why they exist is that kind of for the same reason that exotic birds exist, right? With all their crazy colored feathers and songs and dances, right? It's kind of it's almost a mating dance. It's a way of socially signaling, here's what I'm good at. Here's why, an indicator of my fitness. Even though we're not doing this consciously, this is how these things came about. And this is why we do these things that don't seem to make sense from a survival perspective, like writing books or, running marathons, right? These are things that came about as they were selected in our social environment. And so if that's the case, it makes sense that we would have a part of our brain that's sort of monitoring ourselves on these fronts, evaluating ourselves in the same way that we would evaluate other people. And so when we look at other people and we say, oh, that guy's got a ton of courage, I really admire him, or this person's really kind and compassionate, these are traits that have deep origins in our brains, right? They clearly exist cross-culturally. They've been studied by people like Martin Seligman to exist even in, indigenous tribes that have little connection to modern Western culture.